Welcome. I'm Joe Williams, head of content for Word in Black. Tonight, we're talking about something deeply personal, deeply political, and absolutely essential, and that is food. In Black America, food has always carried two stories at once. One is joy, one is survival. Sunday dinners after church, Auntie's mac and cheese, food as resistance. But there's another story too, written in zoning maps, grocery store redlining, and decisions that determine whether the neighborhood you live in gets a supermarket or a 7-Eleven. Tonight's conversation is at the intersection of those two stories. Our discussion tonight is brought to you by the Knight Foundation. Knight is a nonpartisan and community-centered organization that promotes a healthy and engaged democracy. So food, as I mentioned, is central to Black culture, but Black communities too often have to navigate systems designed to make healthy choices harder, more expensive, and further away. We're talking food deserts, predatory marketing, neighborhoods where it's easier to buy a bag of Wrap Snacks potato chips than a head of lettuce. And we pay a price for that. Diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, poverty, and hunger. Health burdens that did not appear by accident. This conversation, though, isn't about blaming Black people for what's happening to Black communities. What we're going to do is look at the systems and the power behind them. But we also want to talk about solutions. Black farmers, organizers, nutrition advocates, and policy experts fighting to redefine what healthy access and healthy communities can look like. So here's how our event's going to go. I'll talk to our esteemed panelists. Then I'll bring on Word in Black's health reporter, Jennifer Porter Gore, to discuss our upcoming food series. And finally, we'll invite you to take our food survey so we can understand your personal relationship with food. Now, if you have comments, please let us know in the chat. And if you have questions you'd like me to ask, please put them in the Q&A section, and I'll try to answer as many as I can at the end. So let's dig in. So first, we have Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, a former pastor, but an entrepreneur for food access and founder of the Black Church Food Security Network. His nonprofit connects Black churches and their gardens with Black farmers to create local Black-owned food systems. Next, we have Ty Joan Cox, who works for the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities. She's the Vice President for Food Assistance there. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Ashanté M. Reese, author and scholar on the intersection of food issues. Her latest book is Gather, Black Food, Nourishment, and the Art of Togetherness. So I want to welcome all of our panelists and say thank you for being here. We're thrilled to have you and eager for us to dig into this discussion. Doctor, we'll start with Heber Brown. Reverend, kind of curious, what inspired you to take on food as an issue and to do the work that you've been doing?
It really was the people that I love and share life with at the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church here in Baltimore, and seeing some of the things that they were challenged by and challenged with as it pertains to their health. And I just have never been the kind of minister that's just concerned about the spiritual welfare of members of my church. In fact, I have a more expansive view of what it means to be spiritually healthy, and that includes being physically healthy and whole as well. And so seeing some of their challenges with respect to food apartheid, we began to work together to take what we had in our hands, which in that instance was land, and the dynamic, beautiful people, who many of whom came up in the midst of the Great Migration from farms in the South. Like Sister Maxine Nicholas was a champion amongst this group at the church. And we started growing food on the front yard of our own land. And it became a transformative aspect of our ministry. And then it began to spread and get on the congregational grapevine, and other churches started to want to get a part of it as well. And so that's what the work that I've been doing, but it really was love for the people I share life with at my congregation. That was the sustainable fuel that got us here.
Wow. Now, you said two things that I want to kind of dig into. The first is you talked about things that you were seeing in your congregation. Now, what exactly were they? And second, you used the food apartheid, right? And I think we all kind of generally get the idea of what you mean. But talk about the first one, and then we'll follow up on the second one. What were you seeing that made you think that food was an issue that you had to tackle for your congregants to be healthier?
Yeah, the never-ending sick and shut-in list. I mean, for many of us who grew up in church, we're used to hearing about certain people and families who require our prayers. And my God, don't we believe in the power of prayer? And can we interrupt the cycle of some of the same names and families being on this list week by week, month by month, and year by year? And so I was upset and disturbed by creeping feelings of just believing that this is just a fact of life. It's just going to be that, these folks in our church family just going to stay sick. No, we can't be preaching about a God that has all power and gives us the power to overcome this, that, and the other. But then when it comes to our physical maladies and diseases, uh, posture as if we are powerless. And so that's what I was seeing. And then, of course, as a pastor, I have the privileged position and somber position of being by hospital bedsides and being with families in times of bereavement. And so my ear was bent in a particular way toward the sufferings of the people that I shared life with. And I just couldn't hear that, pray about it, keep my fingers crossed, and hope they made it.
Mm.
We had to roll up our sleeves and do something.
And so, Dr. Reese, I saw you nodding your head there when Reverend Brown was talking about the fact that he was seeing a lot of illness and seeing a lot of people on shut-in lists. How does that connect to food specifically? I mean, I know we generally understand that health and food are intertwined, but how is that specific to what we're seeing in the Black community?
Yeah, well, first, I want to say for my latest book, I got a chance to spend a lot of time with Heber Brown. So um, I think he's underestimating some of the work that he and the Pleasant Hope community did. And what I mean by that is Heber is a consummate organizer. I'm just going to put it out there, Doc. It's not like everybody was on board with we're going to grow food in our front yard of the church. And they certainly weren't necessarily on board after Freddie Gray was murdered and this sparked a whole movement because Freddie Gray's murder led to the shutdown of and boarding up of many grocery stores and food establishments in Baltimore, which had a deep impact on the young people in Baltimore because something like 80% of students qualified for free and reduced lunch. And so I just want to point that out because you asked about food apartheid. And as a system, food apartheid asks us to address systems and the interlocking nature of systems, including violence and violence by the police. And that's exactly what Heber and the congregation and later this larger network has partially been about. And I think that gets minimized a little bit. So I wanted to highlight that. But I think speaking to your question about the intersection of food and health, I used to teach middle school. This is what got me interested in questions around food. And I taught a 12-year-old who was type 2 diabetic, which is something I didn't even know was possible at that time, as a 20-something-year-old teacher. And so, part of this is related to access, as you alluded to in your introduction. But another part of it is related to what is allowed to be or not be in our food these days. We are watching a whole movement of people under the Make America Healthy Again banner advocate for less oversight over what's going in our food. And so there's a question around choices, absolutely. There's a question around access, but also this other big bucket that I think we should talk about, which is there are far more things that are allowed to be in our food than there were 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. A lot of times people will say, well, why is this stuff now all of a sudden unhealthy? Our grandparents used to eat the same way. Not saying that that's necessarily how we should eat, but the things they might be eating the same, we might be eating the same things, but the composition of those things are not the same as they were. So I would say, that's three different buckets of things, but that's how they intersect.
Right. Well, and also it reminds me of I was in a Houston for an obesity conference a couple of years ago, and they were talking about bariatric surgery for elementary school, for elementary and middle school students. And one of the lecturers had a graph that showed how obesity rates it was almost like a hockey stick graph where obesity rates right around the 1980s and 90s just shot upwards. And that, they said, was upon the discovery of the miracle drug in food, which is high fructose corn syrup. Dr. Cox, tie that in for us, if you would, or Ty Jones Cox for the American Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. I can't believe I got that out.
Don't worry.
We'll bring you into this conversation and talk to you about what the intersection of Reverend Brown brought up and Dr. Reese brought up, the intersection between like communities and food, and how police and Freddie Gray's murder related to how food became an issue for Reverend Brown. Tie all that together. What makes those things common? Why are they all related to food when it seems like they're so disparate?
So, I mean, I think so where I sit at the intersection of kind of policy and food access. I really focus on and think about making sure that people have the resources they need to purchase food. And food, it just seems so simple. Like people should be able to eat the foods that they believe they need to nourish their bodies. And so when you think about the intersection between systems and system change, which we're talking a lot about, a lot of it, and I had to, like, how I really moved into this is thinking about, like, it is all driven by policy. These are decisions, like active decisions by policymakers, whether it's redlining, like someone else mentioned, whether it's what grocery stores are there, which communities are policed, what foods are in certain schools, which schools have, I mean, it's everything comes down to their decisions that others are making around policy that is having real impact on the ground with what people have access to as far as eating or where they live or how they learn. And so one of your initial questions is like, what inspired you to focus on food? And it's a good question. And I was like, what inspired me? And it was really w- wanted to be Johnny Cochran. All growing up, I was like, I'm going to be just like Johnny Cochran. So I know I'm going to be a lawyer and I'm fighting for my people. And I started off as a legal aid attorney, and I just started seeing people don't even have access to um, their SNAP, food assistance. Their children are eating in schools. They're about to get kicked out of their house. And I was like, wait, maybe I should change the trajectory because I want to make sure that people literally have the kind of basics and they have a champion that's fighting for them for the basics. And so that's how I got into food and noticing that me representing individual clients over and over again isn't as impactful as if I change the system, if I change the policy, if I'm helping them to lobby policymakers and their legislators and knowing who are the real decision makers and making change there. So that's how I got into food, but it is a very just a serious web when you think about the how policy and systems all interact down to like what people can put into their bodies, the food they can eat.
So it seems like everybody, the one commonality is that you're seeing downstream effects of what food does and how it relates to the community. Given that, what's the big picture? We'll start with you, Ty. What's the big picture here? Are we living in a society where everybody has, I mean, we know that the answer to this question is no, but how does it differ based on what you're seeing?
I mean, I think so the big thing I'm seeing right now, and I think it's been for decades, is there is some tie to deservedness and like people having access to food. And that deservedness trick, like, I mean, it goes into like who
What
has food, who has
or
jobs,
your deservedness? You're saying that that the system believes that some people don't
are
deserve.
deserving and some are not, right? So let me talk about that because those who are deserving, we want to make it easy, right? We're going to make sure you're able to get access to food. We'll make the application easier. We'll make sure there's grocery stores. We'll make sure the food is available. Those who we think are not deserving, whether because they're not working, right? Or they are of a certain race, there is a underlying current around deservedness that I think people are easily able to make that calculation in their mind. And so they don't feel the same sympathy for someone who may be hungry if they think it's because they did something wrong or they didn't go to school, whatever their hangup is. And so where I see the country moving is more strict around this deservedness and that I have not seen in a while. There has been a time where we felt take care of the poor, take care of your neighbor, share with your neighbor. You don't care their political alignment. You are going to help. And now it is I feel like there's a retrenchment in this deservedness and who deserves access to food. For me, it's really thinking food and food programs that it's being much harder. And so people make cuts. So for example, and I'll try to go quick. In July, with the reconciliation bill, the Republican Congress, along with Trump, made the biggest cut to SNAP ever, $186 billion cut, right? What that means is that less people are going to have access to food across the country. And the story was that these are all individuals who are not working or fraud. It's all about fraud or people who are not working. 196,000 children in Arizona have been cut off from SNAP since just July of last year. Overall, 3.4 million people have lost SNAP since July of last year. but we are pulling out data around children because you can't tell me that children should be working or that children are undeserving or that children are fraud. So what I'm saying is there is policy decisions that are going to have a ripple effect in our community because the Black community already has a much higher food insecurity rate before these cuts were even in place. Before we even added additional cuts, the Black food insecurity rate was already super high. And this is only going to make it worse. And people don't know who to blame or understand what is going to happen. But
Mm.
yes, 3.4 million people in a year have lost access to food assistance. And that's a lot. That's the biggest drop.
And we're okay with that, apparently. Reverend, weigh in on that. Is America becoming more judgmental, make America judgy again when it comes to food access?
I think to a certain degree, this country's always been judgy when it comes to those of us who've been kissed by the sun. And so, with the assessment that Dr. Jones Cox just lifted up, which I deeply appreciate, I think there is, for me, greater impetus to create and develop systems that have greater degrees of independence from a system that will not be saved. This system, I believe, is beyond redemption.
So you're saying that I think it's like right there in the title of your program that you're developing a system outside of the current food structure because that can't be trusted. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I absolutely am. And of course, I'm also blooming where I've been planted. I'm a third generation Black Baptist preacher. I was on the Sunshine Choir in the usher board, junior usher board. I'm Baptist church, Black church through and through.
Born to it.
Always grown up seeing examples of organized Black people with organized Black money, building buildings or leading initiatives or funding efforts, irrespective and independent to a degree of what the local white power structure would want organized Black people to be doing. So my orientation is more toward a communal self-reliance and for us to bring to bear our genius around, in some instances, dusting off the institutions and social fabric of what existed prior to racial integration. This is a fascinating book I've just started to read about the quality of education for Black children after Brown v. Gore. And the author is making the argument that there was a devastating effect with respect to the educational community, the Black educational community, because of Brown v. Gore, with no disrespect to our ancestors and elders that worked very hard around that legislation. But it is to say that there was some impact that perhaps was not fully accounted for. And in this moment, I'm saying, if that is true for education, could that also be true to agree when it comes to food and health? Have we done some assessments around what was the food and health ecosystem like, even in the midst of very violent racist structures in this country? Where were the ways that Black people were resisting, creating, constructing, imagining that perhaps can be helpful for us in this moment, as much as it feels like so much of that time mirrors this time?
Right. Well, see, it's interesting that you raised that point, because when you were talking about, I'm thinking sharecroppers, I'm thinking people growing their own food. I'm thinking, recipes made out of scraps making a way out of no way. Is that what you're referring to? And if that's the case, is it possible to even come close to scaling that up in our current moment?
Well, I'm betting my life on it, Mr. Williams. One of the things that I did not share in my introduction was that and Dr. Reese is exactly right, it was not only looking at the health profile of those in my congregation, but it also was police brutality that pushed us to establish this national network. And I ended up stepping down from that church, the Baptist church I was pastoring, to devote myself full time to, in some ways, reconstructing and restitching the fabric of what existed before. And so people like Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer have inspiring examples of working with people like Dr. Dorothy Height and so many others with Freedom Farm Co-op and feeding Black people and other poor people, feeding themselves. And what I found is, in the 20th century in particular, and especially around the Great Depression, there are many inspiring examples of Black folk who organized themselves in the shadow of a racist imperial government and established almost like these maroon efforts, these maroon communities that scaled deep, if not scaled wide, in order to provide for the basic nourishment and needs of our community.
Wow, that's heavy. And that's a part of history that I don't think a lot of people understand or appreciate the fact that there was an ag component to the civil rights movement and that there were people looking to feed other people from the sweat of their own brow. Dr. Reese, talk about that if you would. I mean, we're talking like some really deep history in a moment where people are looking to the past and all the struggles that we had back then, and it's now food, not voting rights. What do you make of that? I mean, have we ever had a time where food access was equal? And if so, or if not, I guess, why are we where we are right now?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to just say, Ty, I really appreciated your comments around contextualizing SNAP and like the real human element of that. Because sometimes people hear SNAP and they forget that there are like real people on the other side of those numbers. I also wanted to say, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer, she says that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. And that is how I would describe our food system to answer your question, which is there's never been a time, especially as we've become deeply entrenched in capitalism, especially now in late stage capitalism, where our systems we've always been fueled by inequality, from the removal of indigenous peoples from their land to the bringing us here to do agricultural labor, to current day practices of prisoners doing agricultural labor. Inequality is a part of what makes our food system work, period. And the irony is that our food system is anti-Black, anti-immigrant, anti-poor, and those are the very people that are making it possible for most of us to be able to eat our food on a daily basis. And they're absented from the public in certain ways, right? And so I think that's important to name. And then also the other part is we are living in the long durée of COVID and the pandemic. Since 2020, the average cost of groceries has increased 25 to 30%. So if we pair that with what Ty has just shared with us about the cut of SNAP, so those grocery costs that went up in 2020 never came back down. Actually, they continued to rise. Then we have a real crisis that isn't about the poor people that people imagine. There's a whole lot more people caught up in that crisis. So for example, there was a study that came out during the pandemic that food insecurity lowered for certain segments of the population, actually. So people were like celebrating this as good news. I dug into the data. Do you know who it didn't lower for? People living in the US South, Black people, and Latinx people writ
So what accounts
large.
for that? I mean, why? It seems like we're all part of the same food system, right? What accounts for that disparity?
Capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. So when we talk about food as something separate from wages, and we just saw over 300,000 Black women have lost their jobs within a year. When we talk about food as something separate from the ways our cities are organized, when we talk about food as something separate from housing insecurity, then we miss the fact that the same people who are experiencing food insecurity are probably experiencing all these other things at the same time. It's compounded, right? So COVID was a really, really difficult time for lots of folks. In the same way that I talked about, COVID gives me so much time to walk around the city and I have all this like extra space. That wasn't true for a lot of people, right? And so I think that has an impact. And, I know you want to talk about solutions at some point. And one of the things that I think quite a lot about is that everything we experience in our food system is a crisis of scale. If capitalism is about creating efficiency and efficiency requires inequality, then in the goal to scale up, we are getting further and further away from people and their needs. And then we're also when we're thinking of solutions, we're thinking about all those things at a high level when sometimes the solutions really are closer to the body, closer to the community in some ways, like what Reverend Brown is doing with his work. So I think one of the things for us to think about is when we're building a new world, are we going to be content that we might not have avocados every damn day because avocados come from somewhere much further away from where we are? Can we be content with that? So this question around food access and feeding everyone, to me, is also a question around convenience. It's a question around what am I willing to give up so that everyone has their needs met? We waste so much food in this country. If we didn't waste it, no one
It's
would be
incredible.
food insecure,
Yeah,
right?
it's incredible.
I mean,
Yeah.
literally. No, but I want the audience to hear that if we did not waste 325 million pounds of food a year, no one would be food insecure in this country.
But see, also
Period.
that, I mean, when you recount that statistic, in my mind goes to inequality, right? Because there are people who can afford to waste food, right? It also goes to the fact that we have a corporate farming system that is designed to scale and is in some ways designed to promote waste, right? And we also have
Well,
this
also
big,
not designed to feed people. So I think that's an important thing for people to understand about the corporate food system. The kinds of subsidies that go into undergirding our corporate food system, particularly in the US, isn't reflective of the ideas of needing to. I mean, most of our subsidies go to people who grow corn, to your point
yeah,
around high fructose corn syrup, and soy. People who are regular everyday farmers, actually, quite frankly, many of those people are benefiting from SNAP or should be benefiting from SNAP. We do not
mhm.
live in a country who cares about the people who produce our food. I don't care if it's farmers or the people in a fast food restaurant. It doesn't matter. We do not care about food producers in this country. And our policies, to Ty's point, reflect that.
Well, and also you raised a point about COVID, and I remember, it triggered a thought about how the grocery workers were essential workers, and most of those essential workers were black and brown, and most of those workers were exposed to COVID because they had to go in, give to provide services for people who wanted to have food to eat. And
Mhm.
Ty, I want to bring you back in and talk about how nutrition plays a role here. I mean, we spent a couple of minutes talking about how productivity and how we're a nation that produces a lot of food, wastes a lot of food, how Black people have limited access to food, yet we still have some problems that are associated with food, i.e., obesity, diabetes. I think you talked about that in your earlier work about the justice system. Talk about that. Where does that all come into play?
I mean, I think it's a lot of it is tied down to poverty too and access. So the idea that people don't have access or cannot afford more healthy food, which costs more, or maybe in their neighborhood there's only, like we talked about, convenience stores and or maybe bodegas and not a grocery store with a lot of produce. So when you add that where people live matters, the fact that they don't have the resources, and so they're eating things, because I'm sorry that I'm so stuck in like the SNAP and school meals, but when I just think about SNAP is $6 per person per day. That is the amount, right? So
No.
when people aren't going to it, when mom is going to the grocery store with her family and she's trying to think about how to make that money last for a month, she is thinking of making what is going to make your child feel full, right? The fresh produce is great, but it also goes bad very quickly if I don't make all of it. So what is it going to be that it's going to last me for a month because I make my child feel full and I can actually afford it on $250 or whatever it is for a family of three. So people are making very tough decisions where people who are making the policy decisions are sitting on high and telling people what they should be able to do when they've never even walked in their shoes. You don't know what that's like to have a certain amount of money that you have to make last. They know better. People know what they should get and what is healthy. But at the end of the day, it's like, how do I make my money last? But it is all a design. I really love Dr. Reese's point about like not caring about the people who actually grow our food, pick our food, serve the food, the same people on SNAP. And one thing I know we haven't touched on a little bit around what people can purchase in this like idea around access and food restrictions. The grocery store workers who at one point we were saying are essential workers, they are the same ones who a lot of times are on SNAP. And
Mm,
then they're also the same people that we are asking to police people's purchases of SNAP. Like
right.
how demeaning is that where I am like at the same time I'm probably get SNAP. And you are asking the cashier to be the one to tell the mom or whoever they can't buy that cake or whatever the snack is because now sweets or snacks are bad. Where at the end of the day, people know what they need to buy, right?
Well,
Like they should have the ability to purchase it. I'm not saying that we want to promote soda and diabetes, but if a family wants to buy a birthday cake for their child, the time I've gotten the most really nasty letters from people, like people I don't know, is like when I've testified about people being able to purchase whatever type of food they want, and people tell me about how they don't like how people can buy birthday cakes.
but
I'm
see,
not.
that's the thing well, it's crazy because we have a story that went up on our site today by Jennifer Porter Gore, who's going to be appearing later in the live stream about how those cuts and how those draconian restrictions, no soda, and in theory, it's
Right,
because of what you were describing is that we have a lot of judgment towards
right.
people who are obese or heavyweight and using government funds, and we think that that's well we the problem is that they're just making bad choices, and if we police those choices then they will
Yeah,
be healthier, but
right.
that's not entirely true, and to me it seems like it's more a matter of punitive, right? You're
So that
trying to really I think like you were saying earlier that it's because we really don't see people who are struggling.
deserving.
And that brings me back to you, Reverend. You've toured farms, you're growing your own food. You know how this goes, that it takes a while to grow healthy food, and you aren't going to get strawberries in the dead of winter. And it also may be more expensive to actually grow that food. Particularly if you're going organic. If you go to any organic market, you're gonna be paying more for fruits and vegetables. Yet that's what we want and we think people should have. Talk about that part of it, because another thing I saw was on your website where you had toured some Black-owned farms. That's a whole other conversation that we could have about Black farmers and how land and land use and land acquisition all became a part of the story. But talk about growing food and talk about access to fresh food, what it means, and was that, you talked a little about that being your motivation. Was that one of the things that's driving you, is to get that food from that farm to these people?
Absolutely. Farmers, for the past 15 going on 20 years, Black farmers have been some of my most inspiring teachers. And I'm grateful to be in community with Black farmers all over this country who've allowed me to take my slippery earls off, put on some boots, and walk their sacred and holy ground.
What did they teach you? Do you have a specific
I remember Julius Tillery in Eastern North Carolina telling me, he's a 5th generation cotton farmer, and he's walking me over their land, around his family land. And he points to the tombstones of his immediate ancestors on the grounds. And standing there with him, he said something to me about Black farmers being land rich and cash poor, because all I saw was land back down the country land, like all the way back to the tree line type of land, as far as the eye could see. But it was Julius Tillery who taught me about land rich and cash poor.
Expand on that. What is he? I'm assuming he's talking about the fact that he's got plenty of space to grow stuff, but doesn't have the resources to put in the ground.
That's precisely it. Plenty of land. But when you think about the inputs necessary to maximize use of that land, and stewardship of that land, the cultivation of that land, then that requires a level of capital to make that happen. But, when the local banks don't provide funding, when you get rejected and denied loans, when you don't get access to federal funding in the ways that white farmers do to help bring your farm to a level of a sufficient operation, then you're kind of stuck in this quandary. I saw some of my earliest trips, I saw nutrient-rich food going to spoil in the fields because the mechanisms were not in place. The equipment wasn't there to connect some of those foods to the markets that might have been an hour, 2 hours north of where the farm was located. And that's when light bulbs started to go off in my head about, wait a minute, I keep on hearing about we don't have nutrient-rich food, but I've seen food as far as the eye can see. And so to Dr. Reese's point a little earlier about there's so much food that goes to waste in this country, that if we could just reclaim and recapture that and put the proper investment in supporting these local farmers who are growing food, then it can really change things and turn things around. And so I do understand it now as what we are living through reflects the desire, design, and intention of a system. As Dr. Reese has very eloquently talked about capitalism and the ways that it requires it, right? And so what we started to do very quickly is, as I learned more and more from these Black farmers, Black women, Black men, all up and down the East Coast in particular and Southeast, I started to look at where the gaps were and figure out how can we, as Black churches, particularly in our organization, fill some of those gaps. So that looked like us renting refrigerated vehicles and driving them down ourselves and helping harvest fields and put produce in the vans and drive it back. It looked like us. I felt like a matchmaker because I match farmers and congregations. And I feel like sometimes everybody's holding a red balloon and I'm like trying to figure out what's the best match, because we pair Black farmers and Black congregations. And it's not just about who got the food and we going to buy the food from them, but it's about the other intangibles as well. Who your mama and them? Where'd you grow up? Tell me about yourself. Tell me. It's super relational. Y'all know we've been Black all our lives. You got to, connect on a deeper level, and that takes time. And so I think what Dr. Reese said about, wondering if we had the wherewithal to be inconvenienced. And we've been so socialized by a point and click culture. I want it now and I got the money, give it to me now. And the further and further we get away from what our big mamas and them used to do, I think it puts us in an even more precarious situation. So very quickly, blanching your greens, canning your harvest, deep freezers, the stuff that I grew up watching my mama Geraldine do down the country every summer when we went down after school at out here in Baltimore City. What could it look like for us to, in cohorts, in community, start going and at least examining? And I know I don't want to be a purist in saying we just need to stop going to the grocery store and do it ourselves. I'm not going to be a purist in that way. I'm going to recognize that a both andness may be required at this moment, that yes, organizes around pushing and changing policy. That's to the best of our ability. And at the same time, growing food, learning and putting together systems, marshaling the resources of churches, sororities, fraternities, Black-led organizations to really see the ways that agriculture and policy can go together. Not either or, they can dance together. And this is some of the things that I'm grateful to have learned and continue to learn about the economics of food and how we really got to think like a system, like every part, distribution, production, cold storage, go on down the line. How do we create safe space to study and then to experiment and practice that in real time?
Right. Well, Dr. Reese, expand on that. I mean, you talked about how the system is working as intended. The system is working as designed. Capitalism is the big driver of a lot of really bad food policy. Where do we fit in as A, individuals, and B, a collective, right? You heard Rev talk about all the Black farmers that he was pairing up with Black churches who are distributing food in need. Talk about that intersection and whether or not scaling up, or maybe, try this, what does scaling up look like?
Yeah,
Does
I
it look
saw
more
you
like
do
this
this,
model?
Doc, scaling down. I saw you. So I think a couple of things. I think we have some real decisions to make. I think there is a very material bodily need for food. It is a universal need, and we are trying to meet that need. Meeting someone's biological need for food is not the same thing as sort of meeting their needs as a whole person. And I think that's really important because sometimes when we are fixated on meeting the biological need, which again, super important, and I'm here for it and I participate in those things, we also still got to be holding on to like, what is a broader definition of nourishment? What is our goal here? Is our goal to just not to have people not be hungry, which can be an immediate goal, or is our goal something larger? And so I was just writing like some notes, and one thing I've been meditating on quite a lot lately is that if we talk about our food system as being a product of convenience or normalizing convenience, then one of our greatest works, I think, as people, I'm making an assumption that we're all interested in liberation. But one of our greatest work then is to normalize that liberation is neither convenient nor is it efficient. Liberation, if we think about it as partially a set of relational values, as Dr. Brown was talking about, relationships are messy. Maybe they aren't scalable. Maybe we have something like what Miriam Kava says, 1 million different tiny experiments that are happening all over, and people are responding to the immediate needs of where people are. And I'm not going to go so far as to call myself an anarchist, but what I do believe is that the systems that we have in place are not here. They're not designed to save us, and they're not going to save us. And so again, in the both and, there are some of us who are diligently interested in and are shaping policy in the best way. And I love those folks because those things are going to be the things that matter between someone living and dying, literally in some cases. And I think some of the tiny million experiments that are happening emphasize the relational, keep the longue durée eye on liberation. And really also for us that are interested in food, which is a question I ask myself so regularly, is if I care about liberation and I care about self-determination, does that mean I also care enough for someone to make whatever decisions they want to make, even if they're not the ones I would agree with?
What do you mean by
Because
that?
what I mean by that is sometimes, and if we're honest, some of the movements that I align with and I am 10 toes down for, sometimes we can be just as paternalistic as the right and say it is the way. This is not the way. I'm very Buddhist in that way. There are paths. There are many paths, I think. And I think, and I understand why the health things that we face in our communities are real. I would be remiss if I didn't say, as a researcher, I don't think it is an accident that there's been so little study on the long-term impacts of racism on things like obesity, diabetes, right? And I think, and I'm not saying that racism displaces other things like choices and access, et cetera, But I am saying that I do think that there are mitigating factors that we don't know enough about. And I would not be surprised that when we're long gone, someone has done like some studies that show deeper relationships there. So, I think there are a million experiments and they look a lot of ways. And the last thing I'll say is for this past book that I wrote, I intentionally didn't look at spaces that are usually talked about as like food justice spaces, gardens notwithstanding with what Reverend Heber has been doing. And part of it is I really wanted to think about, there's this anthropologist, Elizabeth Chin, wrote something in 2001 that I think about all the time, which is being oriented toward what's happening versus what's wrong are two different ways of we can be oriented toward what's wrong or we can be looking for what's happening. So I want to look for what was happening. And the thing that I don't think we realize sometimes is we are some of the most creative people who will ever walk this earth. And we have some rituals and traditions that actually already exist among us that could be useful as we think about, changing our food landscapes.
hmm And those systems are out there. And I think the million little experiments that you were talking about are happening. For example, I was in Southeast a couple of months ago on another story, but they had a community garden where people could come in and pick fresh fruit, pick fresh herbs. It wasn't extensive, but it was a little tiny plot of land where if you lived in the neighborhood, you could come in and get something fresh and something good. First time I ever had a fig, like a fresh fig, it was life changing. It was amazing. But I wanted to talk to you, Ty Jones Cox, about the systems writ large. As you talked about, we have the largest cut in SNAP benefits, arguably in history. A lot of that cut, a lot of the axe fell on people who need who need alleviation from hunger, Black communities, and so forth. We are talking about the system writ large and talking about what may be standing in our way. What about these systems that seem deliberately and intentionally pushing against the things that would make Black people healthier and give Black people greater access to food? I'm talking redlining, I'm talking SNAP cuts, I'm talking the Republican Congress. How do we deal with those?
I am going to answer that. And I'm still sitting with Dr. Reese's comment about like just racism impacting obesity and like how it would be great to have a study. And it just made me, I am not a doctor at all. I don't even play one on TV. But just thinking about day to day, the things that we go through as Black people, just us on the screen, like little microaggressions, things that I think I deal with, whether making sure when you come in a room, you have to almost lay out all your credentials in order for people to trust you. And the little microaggressions, the questions about your hair, the things about your children. And then it makes you, by the end of the day, how exhausted we can feel just from existing outside of our home. And then this is what Ty does. I'm not saying other people do. Sometimes I like want to eat something good and not healthy because I had a tough and hard day. I want something that makes me feel good because I do think as Black people, we think of food as like nourishing in so many different ways. And it reminds me of home. It reminds me of sense. It reminds me of family. It reminds me of how to feel safe and of just thinking about, I'm sure there's going to be research, but when you just have to deal with so much, when you just go outside the door and then your idea when you come home is to eat something that feels good, makes you feel like both full, but like full in a different way, not just your body is full, but like you feel like your spirit is. And those aren't always the healthiest things. Like I think about banana pudding
Hmm.
or color, like, right? Not the things that you should eat. And there is absolutely a reason why, we have chronic health conditions that is tied to obesity, whether because of what we eat, the things that our bodies are literally holding for us to exist that aren't healthy. And so I'm sure that shows up in obesity. But that wasn't your question.
Was
But I
in
wanted to talk
conversation that
about that because I mean, it is real and it's something we just all have to deal with. If people aren't able to recognize that comfort, like what that does, like just day to day existing as Black people, especially right now. And so when you come home, if you want to have something that's comforting, it may not be healthy. And so,
That's called comfort food for a reason. And
yeah,
culturally speaking, I mean, we talked about it earlier in the intro about how food and culture among Black people is inextricable. You can't separate them.
right.
So that point is very well made. But I do want to get your thoughts
Yes, sir.
on fighting these systems. Like the systems we all talked about are arrayed against us. I mean, we talked about the food production system. We talk about the food access system, and we're talking right now about consumption. But we haven't really talked about Congress and
Right.
politics. We haven't really talked about the big political picture.
Yes.
We haven't really
So
talked about an administration and a political moment where they are very intent on punishment guide in the guise of savings, in the guise of guidance. Talk about that.
So I think, and I think, no, it feels cliche at this point to talk about voting because at the end of the day, we have got to vote. I know they are doing the most right now between the Supreme Court and these states changing districts, but it is both us voting, talking to our neighbors, because the if we don't change the composition of who is in power, then this is going to keep happening. And I think what I am finding some glimmer of light is that what social media is allowing more people to tell their stories directly without having to move through some type of um, media or with any member, like people are telling their stories and they're making a difference and it's holding these members and elected officials to account. So you voted this way. Let me tell you how it's going to impact people in your district, in your state, in your area because they made when I don't know if you all remember when there was going to be the government shutdown and they weren't going to give out SNAP benefits, although they had money, there
Mhm.
was actually a really like SNAP was trending on Twitter and on Blue Sky and all over the news because people were like, wait, what? You aren't going to pay SNAP benefits even though you have it?
You're
And I
willingly
think
going
they
up hungry.
Right. I think Republicans underestimated that there is actually like the broader public does make care and want people to have access to food. And the fact that you are choosing to take it away is a problem. And they had to change their position. And so us continuing to raise the alarm is important and holding these officials accountable and not letting them use the fraud narrative as the easy scapegoat as to why we're doing these cuts. Actually, why they cut $186 billion in SNAP was to give tax cuts to wealthy individuals and corporations.
Right.
So
And
that
made
is
them permanent, not only on top of
permanent tax cuts by cutting SNAP and Medicaid. So I think it's cliche, but until we get some new people in power, I don't see how else we can change
So
the policy.
it's really interesting. You're tying politics to food policy, and that's not going to change until leadership change. But Dr. Ashanté Reese, you want to jump in?
Yes, because I wanted to say this a long time ago and I forgot, which is thank you, Ty, because what you mentioned about the threat to withhold SNAP, and there's this big response. The Democrats really dropped the ball on this, and so did the rest of us, in the sense that that was a powerful moment, and I understand why. And I know I'm speaking from a place of privilege. I understand why that moment was seen as a victory, but we still have the threats to Medicaid and Medicare that are on the table just in the next cycle of policy things. And so that brings me to the point of part of what we need to be doing in our communities is training for moments like that. How powerful would it have been for politicians who are on the right side of history to be able to hold that line because they know we in our communities are like, we got you. We're trying to feed the people who are going to lose SNAP so that you can keep holding that line so that we can enshrine Medicare and Medicaid in policy in a way that is not going to be threatened in the future. And we saw some of that. Like that was the benefit of social media. I collected funds for people who were going to lose their SNAP benefits. Many organizations did that. And those are those kind of tiny experiments that I think are really helpful for us to hold on to, speaking of positive things. And the last thing I'll say is I would be remiss if I did not say this because it is easy for us to think about this moment, especially because this is the largest cut in SNAP history, as being directly tied to Republicans. But since the 1960s, it has not mattered who has been in power. Food policies, particularly food assistance policies, have always been a hot button topic. And Democrats and Republicans alike have done their share of cutting. They have done their share of sort of doing the thing that Ty was talking about, further trying to reduce who is considered as deserving of assistance and aid. There's a really great book. I'll drop it in the chat. It's called Feeding the Crisis by Maggie Dickinson. It really helps us understand what has changed about food policy since the 1960s. I strongly recommend it. Also, gives us some tools for thinking about what is a way forward policy wise in terms of what should we be asking for and fighting for.
Mm-hmm. And so I saw, Rev, when Dr. Reese was talking about mobilizing and voting, the organizer and you just like kind of burst out.
I can't help myself, Mr. Williams. I will say, in addition to all the other things, when I stepped down from the church I was pastoring, I went back to my home church where my dad, Bishop Heber Brown II, has been pastor for 40 years. I'm an assistant minister now at his shoulder, but I also hold the role of Sunday school superintendent. I am so excited to be the Sunday school superintendent. And guess what we're doing later this year? We are embracing the opportunity to transform Sunday school into a freedom school, and we'll be having citizenship schools throughout the summer. I want to lift up Septima Clark and honor this dynamic Black woman who, in the middle of the 20th century, was making space for Black people to study and learn the political process, to learn how to leverage their power, to learn how to recognize vulnerabilities in a racist political system. And I have a dream that Sunday schools and Black churches could be one of those spaces within the A Million Experiments Plus, where we are looking at every space where we have sufficient agency, access, and voice to say, how do we organize ourselves in this way? And so, yes, I got excited because I get the chance to craft an experiment within the bosom of a Black church that, if successful, and I pray it is, could inspire other pilots and experiments at other Black churches to say, hey, y'all, we need not feel completely powerless, whether it's citizenship schools, whether it's helping to establish political action committees, whether it is running for the school board or other local offices, organizing our money in various ways. I think the both and approach, again, we don't have the luxury to be purists. We don't have the luxury to just wait until another election and we're waiting for the right person. No, daggone it. I'm going to help do my part to help raise the next generation of right folk, quote unquote, right folk, who have a similar orientation, passion, commitment, worldview that prioritizes and centers well-being, flourishing, and nourishing for Black people. And so I think it's the immediate moment that does require focus from some of us, but it's like looking down the line. And so when those little 8-year-olds come into my Sunday school this coming Sunday, I'm excited because I get a chance to plant a seed to help bring about a harvest that I may not live to see. I just got goosebumps. I'm gonna stop right there because I feel like I'm about to get preachy, but y'all get what I'm saying, that we do not have to wait on the sidelines for any others. We can do what we need to do with what we have to make some meaningful gains both now and for the future.
Well, it's always been thus, right? I mean, all the way back to 1619, got to do for self, make a way out of no way. So I want to, we're running short on time, and I wanted to say thanks again to this amazing panel, but I also want to make time to talk about solutions or anything positive that you're seeing. So I wanted to go around and see if y'all can tell me something good about either what you're seeing, what you believe is in our future, or what might be happening on the ground. Ty Jones-Cox, start with you. Jump on in.
I was like,
But I will go back to the fact that I do think that overall the general public does support people having food and having access to food in whatever way it is. And so I do feel I have to remember that those in power who are making decisions are not the majority, and remember that the majority of people do really care about that, and they are working on helping their neighbors have food or have access to food, because sometimes from where I sit, I don't get to see that. And I am excited when I see that. And I'm excited to hear about Reverend Brown's a million different projects and other things. So I'm taking more hope from fellow panelists than what I have.
Right. So there's a lot of good things happening out there. Rev, your turn. What are you seeing that's good?
Super quick. My hoodie says Black Church Power, and I am so excited by the work that I'm seeing churches do right now. There are churches that are right now, just this week, signing long-term MOUs with our organization to make their land and assets available to further Black food sovereignty.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I'm grateful for church gardens, but these long-term leases to say, here, take the land and take the space, it's an inflection point that I think is going to be very powerful for our community, both now and in the future.
Wow, that's amazing. And I meant to ask you about funding and grants and all of that, but I'm pretty sure you've got that tied up, squared away. Dr. Reese, your turn. What are you seeing that's good? What gives you hope?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, nope, they can use more money. Please, if you want to donate to the Black Church Food Security Network, they are accepting donations. The collection plate is going around. I am a student of the
Drop
National
the link
Black
in the
Food
chat.
and Justice. I'm a student of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. I think they are the foremost leading visionaries in terms of bringing Black folks together to envision and think about not just the immediate need, but building infrastructure. I am deeply just honored to even be in their orbit in some ways. And then lastly, I will say, I know people always complain about young people, but every semester I teach young people about race and food. And y'all, the young folks are all right, actually. They got some challenges and we've got some challenges with them. But in terms of grasping these concepts, as this is not just about an individual right, these are things that we really should be trying to build a world around. I'm lucky that I get to see them thinking about these things in real time.
Wow. Well, that's very inspiring. I mean, the younger generations are going to have to they got a lot of work to do, but they seem up to the task from what you're saying. So, we'll put some blessings on that. With that, I want to close our amazing panel. You guys were fantastic. I love the discussion. There's so much more to talk about that I feel like we barely scratched the surface. But I want to give a big thank you to Reverend Heber Brown, who is the executive director of the Black Church Food Security Network, Dr. Ashanté Reese, associate professor at UT Austin and an author on food issues, and of course, Ty Jones Cox, the vice president of food assistance at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Great discussion, you all. Thank you so, so much. And I hope we have you back real soon. All right. With that, we're going to move to the second part of our program this evening and have Jennifer Porter Gore come on and discuss what's coming up with Word in Black and our food issue and what we're doing looking around the corner to talk about this issue and kind of keep the conversation going. So Jennifer, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see you too.
Great. So you're our food editor. Talk about some of the issues that you've been covering around food security, health, and we didn't even talk about food safety, but give us an overview of what you're seeing and what you've been covering for the last few months.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, stories live today about what's the early effects of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and how many people are being affected by that, the millions that have been dropped off the rolls and are also facing new restrictions like the work restrictions and the sugary food restrictions. Basically, I want to say that the food policy in this country is very dynamic. We're seeing a lot of changes, not necessarily all good, but we are seeing, of course, Black Americans adjust, come up with ideas, implement policies locally, change the scene in their local area, and it's actually it's looking good.
Right.
Now, what we're going to do next, we're going to be coming up with some stories on like Black farmers, as were mentioned, and farmers markets, especially Black farmers markets. There's a whole network of them around the country. We're going to do a story on urban farming, like eating local and the efforts to eat local and seasonal, which is also more healthy, as we know. You mentioned food safety. I know we know last year and even now, we've seen a whole lot more food recalls. At least they seem to be a lot more noticeable than in the past and a lot more broad. So what is really going on with food safety, food inspections? Who's really handling that? Our FDA, we don't seem to have an FDA director that we can keep. So how's that affecting things? And then I'm going to do something on what's next in federal and state government policy, because we are seeing states make decisions and enact policies that kind of pick up the slack a little bit from what the government has cut. But, we're going to see how far they can go with it.
Right. And then I noticed you've also been doing some coverage on our esteemed, I say that lightly, Director of Health and Human Services, who has rejiggered the food pyramid and how that's going to affect Black communities and Black consumers. Talk a little bit about RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and how he's been making an impact as far as food is concerned on the nation writ large and on Black communities in specific.
Well, as you know, he's put in place something called the Make America Healthy Again food project, and the Maha food boxes. That idea was floated. We haven't seen that idea come to fruition. Probably won't see it, because what we're finding is that the Maha food policy is not popular. It's great for the trad wives, but everybody's not a trad wife. And frankly, even most of the trad wives aren't trad wives. So
Right.
let's just be blunt about that. The food pyramid is confusing and not really taking hold. And you do see, of course, these changes with SNAP, there's restrictions on sugary foods, but there's no restriction on corn and sugar farmers and corn and sugar lobbyists
Right.
either. So there will be more sugar and there will be more corn and there will be more high fructose corn syrup, but there's also supposed to be a way to make sure people aren't eating it.
Good luck with
Questions?
that.
Yeah, exactly. So, there are a lot of things that still need to be figured out, especially since looks like RFK Jr. is losing popularity among some circles, but the long-term impacts on food are already in place, and those are going to have to be overturned.
Now, one of the other things I wanted to ask is like sort of big picture question here. We at Word and Black have been thinking about this food survey and this food issue for a long, long time. Why does this sort of thing matter? Why should we invest so much resources in talking about food, how we eat food, and how we as a Black community relate to it?
Well, for one thing, food is life.
Mm.
So, and if you're going to talk about health, and it was mentioned earlier by our esteemed panel, there's a lot of intersectionality between food and health of the body.
Uh-huh.
Well, we're not going to solve health problems if we don't solve food problems, including food access problems, and also what actually causes obesity. And
Mm.
notice that it's not just food. There are early studies out there that it really isn't just the food that causes obesity. So let's look at what the role is of food. How do we make sure that every person in this country gets what they need in order to survive? Because let's face it, there's one thing that we need. We need food, we need water.
And make sure that it's all healthy and clean and food safety is there for
And
us,
safe. Yeah, that we're not going back to the 90s when meat was lightly inspected.
to say the least. But yeah, well, it's going to be a really tremendous effort. I think we're going to have a good series of stories, and I think people will be able to get some things out of it, not just talking about food as a cultural phenomenon or food or recipes or anything like that, but just basically talking about how it affects us as people. Because as the panel discussed, a lot of our identity, a lot of our existence is tied to food, especially our existence here in the country. It does behoove us to understand these systems, understand how things are the way they are, why they are the way they are, and how our health is impacted as a result. So looking forward to it. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. And I really appreciate you being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Next up, we want to talk to Dr. Krista Malobo. She is the director of, Word and Black's research division, and she's going to come on to talk about how you, the viewers, and how our readership at Word and Black, how you can get involved and make your voices heard and let people know what you're thinking about what's on your plate. Dr. Chris, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, you're our research director, and talk about what that entails, particularly involving Word and Black and particularly involving food. I understand you've designed a couple of studies. Talk about what you're looking for and how people can participate.
Yeah. So, I mean, as the panel has talked about today, I was so grateful for hearing their opinions and the data around food. But there's already a lot of existing research on food and health in the Black communities. However, it can sometimes lead towards a focus on deficits, on things like what we're not eating or what we don't have access to. And these things are incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But what we wanted to do in this survey is to gain some additional insights that might not have been a part of the larger discourse prior to this survey. So what participants are going to see when they take this survey is that there are these three core areas that we really wanted to focus around. The first being around sentiment and perception, particularly around food. So how do you feel about the food that's available to you? What do you believe about the US food system? So we really wanted to understand some of the attitudes and just general opinions that Black Americans have around food right now, because I do think that context shapes everything else. One of the second big core areas in the survey is relationship between food and well-being and your opinion on whether or not there is one. So not just, physical health impacts that food can have, but then mental health impacts as well. And then the third area is really about strategies and solutions. So what resources might you need, what information might you need, and what changes would really make a difference for you and your community in terms of eating more healthfully. So
Mhm.
that's the big picture of the survey. And if you're Black American, you're 18 years or older, we really want to hear your voice on this.
Yes, we really want to hear your voice. And one thing I might say, Chris, about the fact that you're even at Word in Black is that there seems to be a deficit of what exactly Black America thinks about things, right? That we have a lot, as you mentioned, we have a lot of data about food. We have a lot of information about what we eat, how we're healthy, this, that, and the other thing, but we don't really have a lot about how people feel. So
Mhm.
one of the things I wanted to lift up in our conversation with you is the fact that this is an opportunity for Black people to speak and to be heard and to have that data reflected back in terms of what we cover, in terms of how we cover it. Talk a little bit more about that and what you're hoping to get by listening to people when they call in and take the survey.
Yeah, so I mean, responding to research in a general sense, I'm a social scientist. So I will always make a plug for people being excited to participate in research studies. Your adding your voice to research studies in a general sense matters because you are then shaping not only what gets studied, but ultimately what systems get built out of your responses. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of research on Black Americans and food, but oftentimes just because of who is in the ivory tower or who research scientists are, these studies end up getting designed by people outside of our community. So one of the things that we are consistently doing at Word in Black with these research studies is that we are centering Black voices in the research. And from there, that means that we get better research and then more tailored solutions. And what I really hope for, particularly in this research study, is that we have a fuller food picture. So I think we have a picture that's ever evolving of the barriers that we might face when we think about food. But I am really curious as well about the joy that's associated with the food in our culture. As Jennifer mentioned, food is ubiquitous. It's literally everywhere. It's not just something that we do to sustain ourselves, but it's an entire cultural experience from, conversations that we have with our grandparents about food to the ways that we gather with our families around holidays. So in this research, I just really wanted to highlight that it's not just, we're not just studying what it is that folks are eating, but what food means to us in this sort of cultural, emotional, and even spiritual way.
Right. That's very important. I think it is important for us to have our voices heard. Now, two quick things. How is the research going to be used after it's collected? And two, this is completely anonymous, correct?
Yes. So once we collect the data, we then analyze it to identify different patterns and themes that occur across the community. And that way we get a better, fuller picture of how Black Americans are feeling around food, what we're navigating, and then what are the gaps potentially between what people need and then what systems currently exist. And then from there, what the ultimate hope is with doing, community-based participatory research is that we hope that the findings then inform actionable strategies, sources like toolkits, recommendations, and content like these events that actually reflect our realities that we then share publicly. Because at the end of the day, the data belongs to the community that gave it to us, and that's you all. Yes, you are totally correct that the survey is completely anonymous. It's really important to us that we are building trust with audiences. So we're not collecting names, email addresses, or any identifying information. We're really just collecting or asking about your opinions, perspectives, and experiences around food.
Right. Well, that's very important. It's good to know. Listeners or viewers, the survey, you can take it right now. It takes about 5 minutes. It's
Mhm.
already in the chat. And if you're watching on the replay, go to the description below to complete the survey. And you have until May 27th. And we really, really, really want to know what you think. So thanks a lot, Krista. And we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. So that's our program for this evening. We want to make mention again that tonight's discussion was brought to you by the Knight Foundation. Knight is a nonpartisan and community-oriented organization that promotes a healthy and engaged democracy. I also want to put in a plug for our next program. Our next event is Thursday, May 21st at 1:30 p.m., 1:30 in the afternoon. The registration link is already in the chat. It's going to be talking about religion, hot topics, a lot of stuff in there. I know you'll want to check it out, so please don't miss it. Again, my name is Joseph Williams, Chief of Content at Word in Black. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.